Let me start with a question that sounds simple but quietly reveals everything. Why can you understand English so well, yet freeze the moment you need to speak? You know the words, you recognize the structures, you follow conversations, videos, podcasts. In your mind, everything seems clear. But when it is your turn to talk, that clarity disappears. The sentence collapses, the timing is gone, and silence takes over. Most people explain this by saying, "I'm not good at English." But that explanation is wrong. You don't lack English ability. What you lack is the ability to think in English, at least in real time. And before you misunderstand this, let me be clear. Thinking in English is not about imagining perfect sentences in your head. It is not about translating faster. It is not about forcing your mind to switch languages. In fact, the moment you try to think in English, you have already failed. The real problem is much deeper. Your brain is still operating in your native language, while English is treated as an external system that must be accessed, checked, and controlled. So every time you speak, your mind has to move back and forth between two worlds, and that back and forth is what breaks fluency. This is why English often feels like it's in your head, but not in your mouth. You are not blocked by lack of knowledge. You are blocked by the way your brain has been trained to process language. At Think and Speak English, we look at English not as a subject to master, but as a mental behavior to retrain. Because speaking is not about knowing more, it is about thinking differently. In this episode, we are going to dismantle one of the most damaging myths in language learning, the idea that understanding English naturally leads to speaking English. It does not. And once you understand why, the confusion you've carried for years finally begins to make sense. If you've ever felt like English is always one step behind your thoughts, this conversation is for you.
To understand why this gap exists, we have to look at what actually happens in your brain the moment you try to speak. Most learners believe they are speaking English, but in reality, they are doing something completely different. They are translating. An idea appears in the mind, first in the native language. Then the brain searches for English equivalents. After that, it checks grammar, structure, and accuracy. Only when everything feels acceptable does the mouth finally move. This process feels normal because it is how English was taught, but neurologically, it is a mistake. The human brain is not designed to translate in real time. Translation is a high-level cognitive task that requires attention, memory, and evaluation. It is slow by nature. Speaking, on the other hand, is supposed to be fast, automatic, and unconscious. When you translate while speaking, you force two incompatible systems to work together. One system wants speed, the other demands control. The result is hesitation. This is why you often know exactly what you want to say, yet cannot say it at the right moment. By the time the translation process finishes, the conversation has already moved on. And your brain, sensing this mismatch, chooses silence as the safer option. What makes this more dangerous is that translation feels productive. It feels like effort. It feels like learning. So learners rarely question it. They assume the solution is to translate faster, to memorize more words, to practice more grammar. But speed is not the real issue. The issue is that speaking is not meant to be a conversion process at all. It is meant to be a direct response. And as long as your brain believes that speaking English requires translation, fluency will remain just out of reach, no matter how much you know.
Once translation becomes the default habit, another problem quietly forms, one that most learners never notice until years have passed. Your brain begins to associate speaking English with delay. Every time you translate, there is a pause, a moment of searching, a moment of checking. At first, this pause feels harmless, but over time, the brain starts to expect it. Speaking English no longer feels like a natural response. It feels like a task that requires preparation. This is how hesitation becomes automatic. Instead of responding to meaning, your mind waits for permission. It waits until the sentence feels complete, correct, and safe. And while you are waiting, the conversation continues without you. This delay is not a confidence issue. It is a timing issue. Real conversation moves too fast for analysis. By the time your translated sentence is ready, the moment to speak has already passed. The brain notices this mismatch again and again, and eventually learns a simple rule. Speaking English is risky because it is slow. So, it tries to protect you. It does this by increasing control, by forcing more thinking, more checking, more internal editing. Ironically, this protection makes the delay even worse. This is why many learners say, "I can speak if I have time." They speak better alone. They speak better when rehearsed. They speak better in their head. But real speaking does not give you time. And because translation requires time, the brain never allows English to become automatic. It keeps English locked in the thinking system instead of releasing it into the reflex system. Over time, this habit reshapes your entire relationship with the language. English becomes something you prepare, not something you use. And the more you rely on preparation, the slower your speaking becomes. Until this delay is broken, thinking in English will never emerge, because the brain cannot switch languages while it is still waiting to translate. This leads us to one of the most misunderstood ideas in language learning, the belief that fluent speakers are constantly thinking in English the way learners imagine. They are not. Fluent speakers are not constructing sentences in their minds before speaking. They are not choosing words carefully. They are not monitoring grammar in real time. In fact, most of the time, they are not consciously thinking about language at all. What they are doing is responding. They react to meaning, to intention, to emotion. Words emerge as a result of that reaction, not as a planned output. This is why fluent speech often sounds simple, repetitive, and sometimes even grammatically imperfect, yet it flows. Learners, however, imagine thinking in English as an internal monologue made of full, correct sentences. And because they cannot maintain that monologue, they assume they're failing. But this image is false. Thinking in English is not about hearing English sentences in your head. It is about the absence of translation. It is about meaning triggering language directly without passing through another system. Fluent speakers operate with patterns, chunks, and familiar responses. These patterns have been repeated so many times that they no longer feel like language. They feel like instinct. This is why asking yourself to think in English usually backfires. It adds pressure, it adds control, and it pulls you further into conscious processing. True thinking in English only appears when the brain no longer needs to manage language. And that brings us to the uncomfortable realization: the more you try to control your English, the less naturally it will ever flow.
To understand why this habit is so deeply ingrained, we need to look at how most people were first introduced to English. From the very beginning, English was presented not as a tool for thinking or responding, but as a system to be analyzed. Words were defined, sentences were broken down, grammar was explained. Meaning was something to be extracted, not something to be expressed. This training shaped the brain in a very specific way. You learned to approach English slowly and carefully, to pause, to observe, to make sure you understood before doing anything with it. And this approach works extremely well for exams, reading comprehension, and listening tests. But it trains the brain in the wrong mode. Instead of building pathways for fast reaction, school conditions the mind to stay in evaluation mode. English becomes something you look at from the outside, not something you operate from within. Over time, your brain becomes excellent at recognizing correct answers. It learns to identify errors, choose the best option, and explain why something is right or wrong. These are analytical skills, and they are valuable, but they do not translate into speaking ability. The problem is not that you were taught incorrectly. The problem is that you were taught for the wrong outcome. Education systems optimize for understanding and measurement, not for spontaneous use. So the brain is rewarded for accuracy, not for response, for silence over risk, for thinking over acting. And once this pattern is established, the brain carries it into real-life conversation. Even when no test exists, the mind continues to analyze, hesitate, and wait. This is why so many people can understand everything, yet feel completely powerless when asked to speak. Their brains were trained to consume English, not to think with it. This is where the gap between understanding and speaking becomes impossible to ignore. Understanding English activates one part of the brain. Speaking activates another. And these two systems do not automatically support each other. When you listen or read, your brain is in recognition mode. It receives input, compares it with stored patterns, and decides whether it makes sense. This process is relatively calm. There is no pressure to act, no risk of exposure. You can take your time. Speaking is the opposite. The moment you speak, you move into production mode. The brain must generate language in real time, under social pressure, with no chance to pause or revise. This requires speed, confidence, and automatic access to language patterns. But most learners never train this system. They spend years strengthening recognition, watching videos, reading articles, listening to podcasts, while production is practiced rarely, carefully, and often in isolation. So one system becomes strong, while the other remains weak. This is why you can follow a conversation perfectly, but still fail to join it. Your brain understands what is being said, but it has not learned how to respond quickly enough. The knowledge is there, but it is locked inside a system designed to observe, not to act. This mismatch creates a painful illusion. If I understand, I should be able to speak. When that doesn't happen, learners blame confidence, personality, or talent. But the real issue is structural. Understanding does not activate speaking. Only speaking activates speaking. And until the brain is trained to produce language under real conditions, thinking in English will remain theoretical, something you know about, but cannot access when it matters most.
At this point, many learners start to feel frustrated with themselves. They know they understand. They know they are capable. So why does thinking in English still feel impossible? The answer is not a lack of effort. It is a misunderstanding of how thinking in English actually emerges. Thinking in English is not a switch you turn on. It is not a skill you practice directly. It is a byproduct. It appears only after the brain has repeated one behavior often enough, responding in English without stopping to analyze. Until that happens, the brain has no reason to change its internal language. For most learners, English has never reached that threshold. It has been studied, reviewed, and evaluated, but rarely used in situations that feel natural and frequent enough to matter. So when people ask, "How do I start thinking in English?" they are asking the wrong question. The real question is, what would make my brain stop needing my native language in the moment? The brain only abandons a system when it becomes inefficient. As long as translations still feel safer and more reliable, the brain will keep using it, even if it is slow. This is why forcing yourself to think in English does not work. You are asking the brain to give up a familiar tool without offering a better one. Thinking in English begins only when English responses become easier than translation. And that does not happen through intention or discipline. It happens through repeated use under low pressure, where mistakes are allowed and speed matters more than accuracy. Until then, your brain will continue to choose the language it trusts most. And that choice has nothing to do with your motivation. It has everything to do with efficiency.
To understand this choice more clearly, we need to look at how the brain makes decisions in real time. The brain is not interested in language. It is interested in efficiency. Every time you need to respond, your brain scans for the fastest, safest path to express meaning. It does not care which language you prefer. It cares which system costs the least energy and carries the lowest risk. For most of your life, your native language has been that system. It was built through years of constant use, emotional connection, and real consequences. The pathways are wide, fast, and automatic. There is no hesitation, no evaluation, no self-monitoring. Thought and expression feel like one movement. English, by contrast, is a newer system. The pathways are narrow. They require attention. They often come with emotional friction, fear of mistakes, fear of judgment, fear of sounding less intelligent. So when the brain is under pressure, it does what it always does. It defaults to the system it trusts most. This is not laziness, it is optimization. And this explains why thinking in English disappears the moment a conversation becomes real. The more important the moment feels, the more your brain relies on the language that guarantees safety and speed. Until English begins to offer the same level of efficiency, the brain will never fully switch to it, no matter how strong your desire is or how serious your goal may be. Thinking in English is not blocked by ability. It is blocked by the brain's instinct to conserve energy and avoid risk. And once you see this, it becomes clear that forcing the switch is pointless. The brain does not respond to commands. It responds to experience.
So the real shift does not come from trying harder. It comes from changing what the brain experiences. If English is always practiced in safe, artificial conditions, textbooks, exercises, memorized sentences, the brain categorizes it as non-essential, useful for study, but not for survival, decision-making, or identity. It stays in the practice mode compartment, separate from real thinking. To think in English, English must enter the brain's operational system. That happens when you begin using English to process ideas, not to perform correctness. When you describe your opinions before you organize them. When you explain something even if the structure is imperfect. When you allow meaning to come first and accuracy to follow later. In those moments, English stops being a subject and starts becoming a tool. At first, it will feel slow and uncomfortable. That is not failure, that is construction. New neural pathways are forming, and construction is always inefficient in the beginning. The mistake most learners make is retreating at this stage, assuming something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. The brain is simply recalibrating. Each time you stay in English while thinking, especially when the idea is slightly complex, you send a signal. This language is now useful for real cognition. Over time, the brain adjusts its cost-benefit calculation. The pathways widen, the resistance lowers. Eventually, something subtle changes. You no longer translate because there is nothing to translate from. The thought itself begins in English, not because you forced it, but because your brain has learned that English is now safe, efficient, and worth using. That is the moment when speaking stops feeling like effort and starts feeling like thinking out loud.
And this is where the final misunderstanding quietly dissolves. Many learners believe that thinking in English is a talent,
something you either have or you do not. In reality, it is a habit formed through repeated cognitive exposure. The brain does not ask whether you are good enough. It asks only one question: how often is this system used for real thinking? When English becomes the default language for simple internal tasks, naming objects around you, narrating your actions, forming opinions about what you see or hear, it gradually moves closer to the center of your mental life. These small moments matter far more than long study sessions. They teach the brain that English is not reserved for performance, exams, or special occasions. It is available here and now. Over time, thinking in English stops being something you try to do. It becomes something that happens automatically in certain contexts. You may still switch back to your native language for emotional depth or speed, and that is natural. Fluency is not about replacing one language with another. It is about flexibility. The real goal is not to eliminate translation entirely, but to reduce dependence on it, to reach a point where English thoughts emerge before doubt, before self-correction, before fear of mistakes. When that happens, speaking becomes lighter. Your voice carries ideas instead of anxiety. You are no longer chasing fluency, you are using it. And that is the quiet truth most people miss. You never lacked English ability. What you lacked was permission, repetition, and the right mental environment to think in it. Once those are in place, the language follows. At this stage, the shift becomes practical rather than theoretical. Thinking in English cannot remain an abstract idea. It must be anchored to daily behavior. The most effective way to do this is by attaching English to moments that already exist in your routine. When you check your phone, wait for an elevator, make coffee, or walk down the street, your mind is already active. These are not empty moments, they are thinking moments. The only change required is the language you use internally. Instead of translating full sentences, you begin with fragments, single words, short reactions, simple judgments. Too crowded. I don't agree. This could be better. These micro-thoughts train your brain to associate English with real-time perception, not delayed performance. There is no pressure to be correct because no one is listening. There is only consistency. This is where many learners fail, not because the method is difficult, but because it feels insignificant. Yet the brain is built on accumulation, not intensity. 10 small English thoughts repeated daily reshape mental pathways more effectively than one intense study session per week. When English becomes present in these ordinary moments, it stops feeling foreign. It becomes familiar, functional, and increasingly automatic. And once English enters your daily thinking loop, speaking is no longer a leap. It is simply the next step. As this habit settles in, a second adjustment becomes necessary: how you respond when your thinking feels slow, broken, or incomplete. Most learners panic the moment their English thoughts collapse into silence or revert back to their native language. They interpret this as failure. In reality, this moment is a sign of progress. Your brain is transitioning from translation to direct processing, and during that transition, friction is unavoidable. The key is to resist the urge to fix the thought by translating it perfectly. Instead, you stay with the incomplete version. You allow rough, grammatically imperfect English to exist in your mind. Not sure yet. Something feels wrong. I need more time. These are not polished sentences, but they are real thinking tools. By accepting imperfect internal English, you train psychological tolerance. You teach your brain that meaning matters more than form. This removes the emotional blockage that prevents spontaneous speech. Over time, your thoughts become clearer not because you forced accuracy, but because you gave them space to develop naturally. When you no longer fear broken English inside your head, speaking out loud stops being threatening. Your mind has already rehearsed uncertainty and survived it. And once that tolerance is built, the final shift happens almost quietly, without effort, but with lasting impact. You begin to notice that English no longer appears in your mind as a task to perform, but as a medium that shows up when needed. You stop consciously deciding to think in English. It simply emerges in fragments, images, feelings, short phrases, especially in familiar situations.
ordering coffee, reacting to a comment, forming an opinion. These moments matter more than long study sessions because they prove one thing: English is no longer external to you. This is where many learners misunderstand progress. They expect fluency to feel dramatic, like a sudden breakthrough. In reality, it feels ordinary. English becomes less noticeable precisely because it is being used correctly, as a thinking tool, not a subject of study. At this stage, your speaking improves not because you practiced speaking more, but because your internal processing has changed. You are no longer translating ideas into English. You are having ideas in English. Speed increases, hesitation decreases, confidence stabilizes, not from motivation, but from familiarity. And this is the truth most courses never tell you. You didn't lack ability, vocabulary, or grammar. You lacked an internal environment where English was allowed to exist imperfectly, quietly, and consistently. Once that environment is built, speaking is no longer something you try to do. It is simply something that happens. Before we move forward, it's important to pause and connect what we've uncovered so far with what comes next. Up to this point, we've seen that the real obstacle was never English itself, but the way your mind has been trained to process it through translation, analysis, and control. That explains why speaking feels slow and unnatural. But understanding the problem is only half of the journey. Awareness alone does not rewire thinking patterns. What comes next is the critical shift, from recognizing the mental trap to changing the internal conditions that keep it in place. In the next part, we'll explore how English can stop being something you manage consciously and start becoming something your mind uses automatically, the same way it uses your native language. This is where theory turns into transformation. As we close this episode, take a moment to reflect on one simple but powerful idea. Fluency is not built by adding more English to your life, but by changing how your mind relates to English. You don't speak slowly because you lack ability. You speak slowly because your thinking has been trained to pause, translate, and judge itself before allowing words to come out. Once that internal process shifts, from control to usage, from perfection to meaning, everything else begins to follow naturally. Thinking in English is not a talent reserved for a few. It is a mental habit, and habits can be rebuilt. When English becomes a place where your thoughts are allowed to be incomplete, imperfect, and unfinished, it stops being heavy. It starts moving. And when your thinking moves, your speaking moves with it. This is the deeper goal of Think and Speak English, not to push you to speak more, study harder, or memorize faster, but to help you upgrade the way your mind works with language, so English becomes a tool, not a burden. If this episode resonated with you, stay with us. In the next episode, we'll move from understanding this mindset shift to applying it in daily life, so English doesn't just make sense in theory, but shows up when you actually need it. Upgrade your mind. Improve your English.